I was sitting by the window of my apartment, the sunlight hitting my silk blouse just right, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number, and for a second, I felt a strange pull in my chest. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten, as I stared out at the city skyline. Everything looked perfect, orderly, my life, my apartment, the way I'd built myself up, but that tiny pang of memory crept in like an unwelcome guest. It was her face I saw first, my sister, the one who had once told me I wasn't aesthetic enough for her event. I could still hear her words, sharp and careless, cutting deeper than she intended. And then my mom's voice, echoing her agreement, like my worth had been measured and found lacking. I had smiled through it then, offered my help, even paid for her elaborate event, hiding the sting behind polite nods and laughter. Now, years later, I could feel the irony settling in. I had worked, clawed, and shaped my world in a way they hadn't imagined. My phone buzzed again, this time with a name I knew all too well, pulling me back into a past I thought I'd buried. My hands tightened around the mug, the warmth grounding me, reminding me that the woman who had been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated was still here, stronger, smarter, and more composed than ever. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to see how they'd react when the truth finally showed. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though years have passed. I had spent hours preparing, picking out the outfit I thought she'd like, curling my hair just so, even practicing a smile in the mirror that I hoped looked natural. I wanted to be part of her world, to share in her excitement. After all, she was my sister, and I had loved her fiercely, even when it hurt. But the moment she saw me, her lips curved in that dismissive smirk that made my stomach twist. "You're not really aesthetic enough for this, are you?" she said, her tone casual, almost playful, but it cut sharper than any knife. I froze, the words echoing in my ears. My mom, standing behind her, nodded with that same half-smile, the one that said I wasn't wrong. I was just less. Less than enough. Less than the ideal. My hands trembled, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to tell them that my worth wasn't measured by dresses or decor or Instagram-worthy appearances. But I didn't. I swallowed hard, pretending I understood, even laughed softly, and quietly offered to handle the decorations and catering. I paid for it all myself, hiding the sting behind polite nods, careful not to show that every dollar I spent felt like both love and punishment. Later, in the quiet of my bedroom, I sank onto my bed and clutched the small, silver pendant my grandmother had given me on my 16th birthday. "Remember," she had said, "no one can define your value but you. Not them, not the world. Only you." Her words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, reminding me that even if my family couldn't see it, I could still hold on to myself. That night, I made a decision. I would no longer wait for anyone's validation, not my sister, not my mom, not even my closest friends. I would build my own world, quietly, carefully, where my worth wouldn't be measured by how I looked in someone else's eyes. I didn't yet know how I'd get there, but I knew one thing: I would not be dismissed again. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first flicker of a fire that would never go out. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of a new life, a life I would quietly carve out for myself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. I threw myself into work, taking small freelance projects at first, anything that would allow me to prove to myself that I was more than a pretty accessory to someone else's plans. Nights blurred into mornings as I sat at my desk, fingers tapping across the keyboard, sketching, planning, learning. Every setback stung, but each small win sparked a fire that grew inside me, unstoppable. It was during one of those long nights that I met Ms. Parker, a seasoned designer in her 40s with an uncanny ability to see potential in people others overlooked. She noticed me struggling with a client proposal, sat beside me, and said, "You have vision, but you doubt it. Stop apologizing for it." I remember staring at her, thinking someone had finally seen me. Not the me my sister mocked, not the me my mom brushed aside, but me. That belief became my fuel. I threw myself into learning everything I could, marketing, negotiation, business strategy, anything to make my dream untouchable. I made mistakes, yes, plenty of them. There were nights I cried into my pillow, convinced I would fail, that the world was too big and I too small. But slowly, the small victories stacked up. The first big client who believed in my ideas. The first profitable sale that made me feel like I could breathe. The first moment I realized I was standing on my own 2 feet and no one could knock me down unless I let them. And all the while, I kept my success hidden. To my family, I posted modest updates on social media, the occasional photo of a coffee cup on my office desk, a vague mention of work milestones. They never knew the scope of what I'd built, the company I had started from my bedroom floor, the partnerships I had secured, the investments I had made. The truth was mine alone, and that truth was powerful. Every paycheck, every contract, every small victory was a brick in the fortress I was building, not just around my life, but around my self-worth. I became meticulous about my image, my environment, and my personal brand, not for anyone else's approval, but because I owed myself that respect. I learned to relish solitude and to trust my own judgment, even when it contradicted everyone else's expectations. And yet, there was always that lingering thought, quiet and insistent, like a shadow at the edge of my mind. One day, they'll see. One day, they'll realize what they underestimated. And when that day came, I wanted to be ready. Not angry, not bitter, but undeniable. I had become a woman who no longer waited to be seen. I had become a woman who could finally step into her own light, fully and unapologetically. The day they walked into my world, I almost didn't recognize the lingering nerves in my stomach. My sister and mom had arrived expecting, well, they didn't know what they were expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. I watched them step through the glass doors of my office, a space I had built from scratch, every detail deliberate. The walls were lined with tasteful art I had collected on trips I had taken alone. Shelves held books on entrepreneurship, design, and leadership alongside photos of milestones they had never seen me reach. My office smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cedarwood candles, a subtle but deliberate combination. I had chosen it to feel grounding, to remind me of the woman I had become, the woman I had fought to be. I stood behind my desk, composed in a tailored blazer, hair pulled back, nails polished the exact shade of confidence. I let them take it all in before I said a word. For a long moment, they just stared. My sister's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking from the sleek design of the room to the subtle but unmistakable aura of control I exuded. My mom's lips pressed into a thin line, shock and confusion warring on her face. I smiled, a calm, deliberate smile that carried none of the apology I had once offered freely. "I assume you expected something different," I began, my voice smooth, confident, carrying the weight of years they hadn't accounted for. "Maybe the timid, unsure version of me you dismissed. The one who paid for your event without complaint. The one you decided wasn't aesthetic enough." My sister's eyes widened, a flicker of guilt crossing her face, but I didn't pause. I let the silence stretch, letting them feel the gravity of underestimating me. Then I dropped the truth. "I own this company," I said, gesturing around. "I started it in my tiny apartment, working nights while everyone else slept. My clients are global. My net worth is something I never shared because I wanted to focus on building it, not on impressing anyone who couldn't see my value." Their reactions were instantaneous. My sister's hand flew to her mouth. My mom's eyes welled up, a mixture of disbelief and shame flashing across her face. I continued, steady, letting each word sink in. "All of this," I said, sweeping my hand across the room, "is mine. Every achievement, every step forward, every victory you thought I wouldn't reach, you never saw it because you never cared to look. But it's real. And it's undeniable." I watched as they absorbed it, shock transforming into something heavier, regret, awe, even a quiet admiration they hadn't allowed themselves to feel before. And for the first time in years, I felt the full weight of my own power, unshaken by their expectations, unbroken by their past judgments. They had walked in expecting to see someone diminished. Instead, They found a woman fully realized, unashamed of her success, and in control of her own narrative. And in that moment, I realized that the past no longer had a hold on me. Not their words, not their opinions, not their approval. I had stepped into the light they refused to acknowledge, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. I watched them, still frozen in the doorway of my office, and I realized something important. The power balance had shifted. I was no longer the one they could dismiss with a careless comment or a nod of approval. I was the one who set the terms now, the one who could decide how, or even if, they would be part of my life moving forward. I took a slow breath, letting my presence fill the room, then spoke. I am willing to share this life I've built, but on conditions that reflect respect, growth, and honesty. I will not bend to the same old patterns that caused pain in the first place. My sister swallowed, nodding slightly, but I didn't let her relief distract me. First, I said, you must understand that your actions have consequences. No more dismissing others based on appearances or social expectations. You have talent, creativity, and perspective, but they must be nurtured, not overshadowed by insecurity or judgment. My mother's eyes softened slightly, but I continued, firm yet measured. Second, if you want a relationship with me moving forward, it must be built on mutual respect. No favoritism, no comparisons, and no undermining. I will not finance your desires or make up for choices you are capable of making yourself. I saw the hesitation in both of them, but also a flicker of recognition. They understood the stakes now. I wasn't punishing them. I was demanding change. I was demanding that they step into their own worth, just as I had done. Finally, I said, letting the weight of my words settle, you must pursue your own paths with sincerity. I will support your efforts if they are genuine, not performative. I will celebrate your successes, but I will not tolerate attempts to pull me back into the past or diminish what I've built. I paused, letting the air settle between us. I am compassionate and I care, I said softly. But I will not sacrifice my boundaries for anyone, not for family, not for history, not for guilt. For the first time in years, I felt the room shift. My sister straightened, a quiet determination in her eyes, and my mother nodded, a promise to try, to learn, to change. They were beginning to understand that the past had ended, not erased, but redefined. And I was the author of that redefinition. I realized then that this moment was more than just power, it was responsibility. I had the upper hand, yes, but I also had the chance to guide them toward growth, to turn their regret into action, and to make sure that respect and self-worth were no longer negotiable. I smiled quietly to myself, feeling the fire of independence I had nurtured for years finally burn brightly in the open. I had the power now, and I was using it with clarity, intention, and grace. Weeks passed after that confrontation, and slowly, subtly, I began to notice change. My sister started taking her own creative projects seriously, sketching, designing, and even launching a small online venture she had once dismissed. My mom, too, began listening, not just hearing, but really listening, when I shared my thoughts, acknowledging her own mistakes without defensiveness. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I watched them grow, not out of obligation, but out of genuine effort, and I felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with recognition or praise. I realized that the woman they had once underestimated, the one they thought would always be less, had not only survived but had created a space where others could finally rise too, if they were willing. One evening, I held the silver pendant my grandmother had given me all those years ago, the one I had clutched in my darkest moments. I traced its delicate edges and felt the weight of her words, the wisdom she had gifted me. No one can define your value but you. Now, those words weren't just comfort, they were triumph. They reminded me of the journey from being overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued, to a place of independence, clarity, and grace. I stood by the window of my apartment again, looking out over the city that had witnessed my rise. The skyline shimmered with possibility, reflecting the life I had built for myself, the life I had claimed, piece by piece, against doubt, judgment, and pain. And I understood something essential. The past could no longer touch me. Its echoes had shaped me, but they did not control me. I felt a quiet strength settle in my chest, a sense of completeness I had never known before. I had paid my dues, faced my fears, and risen above the expectations of those who could not see my worth. My life was my own, fully realized, unapologetic, and beautiful in its authenticity. And as I whispered to myself, a soft but resolute final thought, I knew it to be true. I am enough. I always was, and now everyone else finally sees it too.